So I'm here today with Oscar O'Connor. This is the first of our new web series where we're covering cybersecurity related topics, how they relate to business and your organisation, and from a wider kind of viewpoint, how these things could be perhaps prevented, mitigating factors and things like that. Oscar's got a lot of experience working across multiple industries, rich history of cybersecurity experience, and we'd like to talk today about what's going on in Russia.
Good to be here, and I think what we're seeing in Russia at the moment is a fairly worrying echo of historical events around Estonia and Georgia, where in Estonia there was very widespread cyber attacks, which all the indications seem to be that they originated in Russia on critical national infrastructure, on the banking sector and on the government sector. More worrying was the events in Georgia, which were simultaneous with a very large build-up of military hardware and personnel on the borders of Georgia, and during an interregional dispute involving the Georgians and South Ossetians. And I believe, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe the South Ossetian regional government have asked the Russians to send military assistance to protect them against a perceived threat from the Georgian state. When you now look at what's happening, or what has happened over the last few years in Ukraine, with the annexing of Crimea, with irregular troops that looked suspiciously like Russian regular troops, I believe the government described them as taking holidays in Ukraine, armed to the teeth and driving tanks, moving into the eastern part of the nation. The fact that there are cyber attacks ongoing in Ukraine and a continued build-up of Russian military on the border and indeed inside the border should make us all worried that increasingly we're seeing tactics, and I think this is not just about nation states, but I think we are likely to see similar sorts of tactics from terrorist organisations, where a cyber attack is a prelude to some kind of physical kinetic attack, weaken the defences, affect the communications network so people can't call for help, and then move in militarily. There are noises from Western governments threatening sanctions and so on, which is encouraging. But history says, certainly in my reading of it, the Russians are not that bothered about sanctions. That certainly hasn't seemed to affect any of the sort of geopolitical behaviour over the last few years.
There was, I think the most recent update was that governments are threatening to remove Russia from the global SWIFT banking system, stop cash exchanges in and out of the country. But there was an interview with the Ukrainian ambassador recently where he felt that these sanctions weren't enough and it wouldn't dissuade Russia from making this into a cyberkinetic attack. If we look back to Georgia, you touched on that earlier, when they escalating their presence around the borders, there was a whole range of cyber attacks. They took down public-facing government websites and services, but they also attacked hospitals and public infrastructure and actually caused real damage there. Is this something that we've seen a rise in attacks against infrastructure, as you mentioned, from cyber criminals with things like ransomware attacks and things like that? Where do you think that we're at with that at the moment in terms of defending against those kind of things? We've offered some military hardware to Ukraine, anti-tank missiles, and we sent them some soldiers to train them. Do you think that we should be sending some cybersecurity help, assistance and expertise there? Or what are your thoughts on that?
If they were to ask for it, we definitely should respond positively. Ukraine's a pretty sophisticated society and very much connected, and they do have a strong cybersecurity sector, but nobody's perfect. And so if the Ukrainians want our help, we should definitely provide it. We have in the UK, the USA and the NATO allies, particularly you look at smaller nations like Estonia, where the entire nation is connected, and they're probably one of the 2 or 3 leaders in the world in cybersecurity. As part of our collective defence, cybersecurity is now one of the main military domains, and we should be providing assistance where we can. Absolutely.
Okay. And I think that if we look at the way that modern warfare starts now, we're seeing more evidence of it starting with cyber warfare. It starts in the digital domain and then becomes sick. Even in conflicts where we've been involved, it involves some degree of kind of cyber reconnaissance work and stuff like that beforehand, taking control of the infrastructure and things. Could this like obviously with Georgia and Estonia, they were the first that we kind of publicly saw. Could this be the beginning of the way that things go? Do you think that we might lose the kinetic aspect of it and it just become kind of cyber warfare? Or
that's a really interesting question. Let's draw the parallel with criminal activity. You know, in the days of my youth, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, the kind of top level criminals were armed bank robbers. That was, if you wanted to make a big score, you either dealt in drugs or people, or you robbed banks. Those are all high risk jobs. There's a high probability of getting caught. If you're carrying a weapon, there's a relatively high priority of being shot, neither of which would be described as an optimum outcome for the criminal. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of organised criminal networks shift their focus, not entirely, but substantially into cybercrime. And I believe, from what I've read and seen and talked with law enforcement official, there's two main aspects to it. One is actually committing crime, and the other is facilitating and helping to obfuscate crime in the physical world. So drug trafficking, arms trafficking, people trafficking are all facilitated and enabled with cyber activity. And thus the risks associated with those physical activities have been reduced from the criminal's perspective. The fact that you can commit crime across borders, making the law enforcement organisations' job much more difficult, judicial processes take a long time. All of those would point to cyberspace, for want of a better term, being a really good place to conduct warfare without physical risk to you. Will we lose the kinetic element? I don't believe we ever will, partially because nations like the UK, France, Russia, China, America economically depend very heavily on very substantial defence industries, and the political pressure that would be brought to bear if those nations decided to scale down their physical military in order to build up their cyber capability, I think hundreds of thousands of people would lose their jobs. That I don't think that is likely to happen in my lifetime or my children's life. Do I think we'll see a reduction in the number of physical armed conflicts in areas where cyber attacks are more readily achievable? Yeah, I think we probably will. I think the risk of total annihilation through nuclear war, nuclear attack still exists, and that will probably calm matters. Mutually assured destruction is still there, whether it's US, Russia, US, China, Russia, it doesn't matter. If it happens, everybody loses, and everybody knows that. So I think that the probability there is fairly low. You can't actually keep and hold territory unless you've got a physical presence on the ground. And if you as a nation need the physical resources of a neighbouring nation or another nation, whether that's access to warm water ports, as we saw in Crimea, whether it's access to oil and gas or rare earth minerals, the possibility of physical invasion remains in certain parts of the world. It seems, I have to say, rather less popular these days than it was 100 years ago, where grabbing other people's territory seemed to be entirely de rigueur for aggressive governments. We seem to be slightly more civilised, I hope, in that respect, and try and do trade deals. It's there, it's ever present, and relaxing defensive postures on the basis that probably not a good idea.
And I suppose another part in this would be with cyber warfare, allies and partnerships can be built up globally So it's not just about which country is your neighbour, but it's which support you ideologically.
Yes.
Can get involved with cyber attack and defence. So part of this kind of shift will see new partnerships and kind of boundaries forming around those kind of cyber partnerships and things.
It's a stage on which smaller countries can play a bigger role. I mean, we mentioned Estonia earlier. You know, the Estonian contribution to NATO cyber defence is massive in proportion to its size. So far bigger than pretty much any other nation in NATO. Obviously, bigger countries also make contributions, but proportionately, per capita, Estonia is probably NATO's leader in cybersecurity in that sense.
It's an interesting time to see this all unfold, and hopefully you will keep an eye on the situation over the next few weeks and see what happens at the border there, and hopefully tensions simmer down.
Good sense will prevail and tempers will cool.
Thank you, Oscar, for your guidance and thoughts there on kind of future of warfare and what we're seeing unfold at the moment in Ukraine. We'll follow the story and keep up to date with things, and we'll catch you in the next video.
Thank you very much.